It began with the snow. A silent cascade blanketing the small village of Windcroft in a white so pure it seemed otherworldly. The kind of snow that muffled not only sound but also a sense of reality, casting everything in a surreal glow. I had arrived just before dusk, the weight of the journey settling heavily on my shoulders as I stepped out of the carriage and onto the cobbled streets. Windcroft was unlike any place I had ever known. The cottages, with their steeply pitched roofs and diamond-paned windows, looked like relics from another century, untouched by time. Smoke curled lazily from their chimneys, and faint golden light spilled from inside, promising warmth and company, promises I had little intention of accepting. My purpose there was practical, or so I convinced myself. The manor at the edge of the village had come into my possession through a distant relative whose name I barely recalled. Its crumbling state and ominous reputation were whispered about even in the neighboring towns. But inheritance is inheritance, and I had come to inspect the property, with the faint hope of selling it to fund less spectral endeavors. Yet, from the moment I arrived, the air itself seemed charged with something unspoken. Villagers regarded me with cautious glances, their pleasantries cut short as if afraid to linger too long in conversation. My inquiries about the manor were met with vague mutterings about past events and a season best left undisturbed. As twilight deepened, a peculiar sound drifted on the wind, a melody, soft but insistent, threading its way through the streets. It was beautiful at first, haunting in its purity, but as the notes lingered, they seemed to grow heavier, weighted with something sorrowful. The source of the music eluded me. It wasn't coming from the church, nor any of the cottages I passed. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around me like the snow itself. "Where are the singers?" I asked a young boy I passed on the street. He froze, his eyes wide with something bordering on fear. Without a word, he turned and ran, leaving me standing alone under the street lamp's flickering glow. The melody swelled, and I found myself walking without purpose, as though compelled by the song's pull. The streets narrowed, the buildings pressing closer together as I approached the outskirts of the village. Soon, I stood at the gates of my inherited manor. Its silhouette loomed against the indigo sky, its windows dark as if it had been sleeping for decades. A single lantern hung beside the door, flickering faintly. As I stepped closer, the music grew louder, and with it, a strange sensation crept over me. It wasn't fear, precisely, but an uneasy familiarity, as though the notes carried memories I had no right to own. The front door was unlocked, and I pushed it open with more effort than I anticipated. Inside, the house was cold, not the natural chill of winter, but a penetrating frigidity that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. My breath clouded before me as I ventured further in. And then the music stopped. It didn't fade, nor drift away, but ceased entirely, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. I stood there, listening to nothing but the soft creak of the house settling. My gaze fell upon the grand staircase, its banister polished to an unnatural sheen despite the house's disrepair. At the top of the stairs, a shadow moved. Not the kind cast by flickering light, but something deliberate, purposeful, and impossibly still. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand who was there, but the words failed me. For as much as I willed myself to deny it, I knew I was no longer alone. The shadow remained motionless, perched at the top of the staircase like a sentinel of the forgotten. My instincts screamed to flee, but my feet betrayed me, rooted to the ground as though the very boards conspired against my escape. Then, it shifted, a languid motion, unhurried and deliberate, as if gauging the effect of its presence. The air thickened with something oppressive, something wrong. Finally, as though released from an invisible tether, my body moved. I stumbled back toward the door, my hand fumbling for the latch. The cold metal resisted, or perhaps my shaking fingers failed me, but before I could make sense of it, a sound shattered the silence. Laughter. Soft and distant at first, it rose like a tide, rippling through the manor with a cruel familiarity. It wasn't the mirth of children or even the forced cheer of holiday gatherings. It was hollow, fragmented, and laced with malice. My pulse quickened as I turned back toward the staircase. The shadow was gone. The laughter seemed to travel, echoing through the house, pulling me deeper into its labyrinthine halls. I hadn't the sense to leave, nor the courage to follow outright, so I stood frozen until the sound faded into the vast silence of the place. When I finally managed to unlatch the door, the outside world greeted me with a disorienting stillness. The village, visible through the skeletal trees, seemed untouched by what I had just encountered. But the moment my boots crunched against the fresh snow, the music began again. This time, it wasn't distant. It was here, all around me. The carol's melody was familiar, a tune once sung cheerfully during my own childhood, Good King Wenceslas. But something was off. The harmony was fractured, the words twisted just enough to distort their meaning. Good King Wenceslas looked out, when the snow lay round about. The voices weren't human. They were shrill and elongated, each note stretching too long, as though the singers struggled against some unseen force. My gaze darted toward the village, hoping to see some sign of life, some proof that this was the work of a strange but harmless tradition. Instead, I saw shadows moving along the rooftops. Not people. Something else. I couldn't discern their shapes, only the impression of movement, a slow, rhythmic glide that defied explanation. I stepped back instinctively, my boots sinking into the snow. The music swelled, growing louder and harsher, until it felt like the notes were pressing against my skull. And then they spoke. The singers, or whatever they were, did not speak as one, but in a disjointed chorus, their words a litany of accusations. Hear us, see us, remember us, each phrase struck me like a blow, dredging up feelings I couldn't quite place. I stumbled back toward the manor, desperate for the illusion of safety its walls might offer. The door slammed shut behind me of its own accord as I crossed the threshold. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling as I pressed my back against the door. For a moment, there was only silence, and then a faint sound reached my ears, the unmistakable creak of floorboards above me. I looked up. A small object came tumbling down the staircase, its descent slow and deliberate as though nudged by an unseen hand. It stopped at my feet, and when I stooped to examine it, I felt a cold sweat break over my skin. It was a child's wooden toy, a simple carved figure of a man pulling a sled. Its painted features were chipped and faded, yet its eyes seemed unerringly alive. Behind me, the laughter returned. This time, it was closer. I clutched the wooden toy in trembling hands, its surface smooth yet oddly warm, as if it had absorbed the life of countless owners before me. The laughter swelled once more, curling around me like smoke. But this time, it wasn't alone. Faint footsteps began to echo above, each one deliberate and agonizingly slow. I raised my head toward the staircase, my heart pounding against my ribs. There was no one there, no shadow, no figure, only the oppressive silence that followed the footsteps' final thud. "Show yourself," I shouted, surprising myself with the force of my voice. No response came, but the stillness was worse than any reply could have been. It hung heavy in the air, the sort of silence that seemed to amplify the slightest sound. A draft brushed past me, carrying with it the faintest scent of pine and wax, as though someone had just extinguished a holiday candle. The wooden figure slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the floor. The sound seemed to awaken the house itself. The lantern by the door flickered violently, and somewhere in the distance, a faint melody began again. This time, it wasn't the fractured carol. It was something slower, a dirge, mournful and steeped in sorrow. I couldn't stop my feet from moving, following the sound as though tethered to it. Through the dim corridors of the manor I walked, each step seeming to take me further from sanity. I found myself in a grand room, its walls lined with bookshelves reaching impossibly high. A single chair sat by the window, draped in an old tartan blanket. On the floor before it was a record player, its needle scratching lightly against the end of a record. The source of the music. I reached for the player, hesitating only for a moment before lifting the needle. The silence that followed was suffocating, but before I could collect my thoughts, a voice spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The words were faint but clear, and they weren't my own. I spun around, expecting to find anyone, standing there, but the room was empty. My breath fogged the air as I scanned the shadows. The voice returned, this time closer. "You can't stop it. No one can." I turned toward the window, and there, reflected in the frosted glass, was a figure. A woman, clad in an old-fashioned cloak trimmed with fur. Her face was pale, almost luminescent, her features sharp and stern. But when I turned to face her, the room was empty. The record player sprang to life on its own, the dirge resuming with a deafening wail. The needle spun faster and faster until the sound became an ear-splitting cacophony. I covered my ears and stumbled backward, colliding with the bookshelves. And then it stopped. The room fell into silence once more, but in its place, something new lingered, a presence. I could feel it, heavy and watchful. The air itself seemed to thrum with it. Before I could make sense of the moment, the frost on the window began to melt, as though warmed by invisible breath. Slowly, words formed in the condensation. "Remember the night. Before it's too late." I staggered back, my heart racing as I tried to comprehend the message. The lantern in the hallway flickered again, and with it came the faint strains of the twisted carol drifting through the manor. The shadows grew deeper, the corners of the room stretching impossibly far. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, and it wanted something from me. I fled the room, the haunting melody of the record player lingering in my ears as I stumbled down the hall. The manor's dim corridors twisted around me, each turn unfamiliar, each shadow heavier than the last. My breath came in shallow gasps, the frost on the windows now spreading along the walls like veins. The carol returned, louder and clearer this time. The voices, those impossible voices, sounded nearer, as though the unseen choir had gathered just beyond the walls. Their harmony was grotesquely precise, their words sharp enough to pierce the mind. Good King Wenceslas looked out, when the snow lay round about. The air carried an ominous vibration, and as the chorus swelled, the walls began to tremble. I turned a corner and found myself in a long gallery lined with portraits. Each frame was ornate, gilded with time-worn patterns, but the figures within were anything but ordinary. The faces stared back at me, eyes too vivid, too knowing. I could swear one of them blinked. "Stop it," I yelled, my voice breaking in the vast emptiness of the gallery. "Leave me alone." But the carol grew louder still, and the figures in the paintings began to shift. One by one, they turned their heads, their gazes following me. I froze as the closest portrait, a stern-faced man in an outdated suit, smiled. "Too late," he whispered. The glass of the frame cracked, a jagged line spreading like lightning. I stumbled back, and suddenly, the hallway seemed to tilt, the floor beneath me shifting as if the house itself had turned against me. I ran, the sound of the carol chasing me like a predator. The light of the lanterns flickered violently, casting fleeting, distorted shadows. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step reverberating with an unnatural echo. When I reached the main staircase, I stopped. At the base of the steps stood a group of figures, their shapes hazy and indistinct. They were cloaked in shadows, their heads tilted as if listening to some unheard command. The choir. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, but the sound they emitted was unholy, a collision of voices, high and low, rising and falling in a way that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. One figure stepped forward, its shape becoming clearer. A child. A boy, no older than 10, holding a tattered hymn book. His eyes were voids, endless and black. He raised one pale hand, pointing at me. "You must remember," he said, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "If you don't, we'll never rest." "Remember what?" I shouted back, desperation rising in my chest. The boy's head tilted, the faintest hint of a smile curling his lips. He began to hum, a single note that resonated deep within me, stirring memories I couldn't place. The other figures joined him, their voices weaving a new song, slower, mournful, and hauntingly familiar. I clutched the banister for support, the room spinning around me. The hymn they sang wasn't just a melody. It was a story, a fragment of a tragedy buried in time. The boy stepped closer, his empty eyes fixed on mine. "Before midnight. Or it begins again." And just like that, they vanished. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant toll of a bell. 11 chimes. 1 hour left. The words on the frosted window returned to me, "Remember the night." I turned toward the manor's grand doors, determination hardening in my chest. Whatever the truth was, it lay beyond these walls, buried beneath snow and time. I would find it. Or I would join them. The clock struck 11, each chime reverberating through the manor's walls like the tolling of a distant funeral bell. I descended the staircase cautiously, the weight of the unseen choir's warning pressing heavily on my shoulders. The lantern I carried cast a feeble glow, its light flickering as if uncertain of its own strength. Snow had begun to drift through the cracks in the old windows, settling on the wooden floor in patches that glittered eerily. The air held a charged stillness, as though the house itself was watching, waiting. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. The front door loomed before me, its iron fixtures frosted and forbidding. Every instinct screamed for me to flee, to escape into the night and leave this cursed place behind. But the choir's haunting refrain lingered in my mind. "Before midnight. Or it begins again." Taking a deep breath, I unlatched the heavy door and pushed it open. The wind outside howled like a wounded animal, carrying with it the faint strains of the carol. Snow swirled in furious eddies, blanketing the village in an almost suffocating silence. I stepped outside, the crunch of snow beneath my boots the only sound in the world. The village, so picturesque by day, was now a tableau of desolation. Every window was dark, the homes mere silhouettes against the gray sky. And yet, the church at the center of the square glowed faintly, its stained glass illuminated by an unnatural light. Drawn to it, I moved through the snow, my breath visible in the frigid air. The closer I came, the more distinct the carol became, its twisted melody weaving through the wind. It wasn't coming from the church itself, but from the ground beneath it. The doors of the church groaned as I pushed them open, revealing the nave bathed in an otherworldly glow. Candles burned on every pew, their flames unnaturally steady, despite the drafts that whispered through the space. At the altar, the wooden nativity scene stood, but it was not the serene display I remembered from earlier. The figures were broken, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish. The shepherd's crook lay snapped in two, the angel's wings were charred, and the infant in the manger was missing entirely. A terrible realization struck me. The song wasn't coming from the church, but from beneath it. I spotted a trapdoor near the altar, its iron ring covered in frost. Kneeling, I gripped it with trembling hands and pulled. It opened with a groan that echoed like a scream, revealing a stone staircase descending into darkness. The carol swelled, louder now, its notes dripping with malice. It pulled at me, compelling me downward despite every fiber of my being urging me to flee. I descended cautiously, the lantern barely piercing the shadows ahead. At the bottom, I found a cavern carved from the earth, its walls lined with ancient carvings. The images depicted scenes of celebration turned to despair. Villagers gathered around a tree, their faces lit with joy, only for the next panel to show them weeping as the same tree burned. At the center of the cavern stood a stone pedestal, and upon it rested a single object, a small, carved figure of an infant, eerily similar to the missing piece from the nativity scene above. Its surface shimmered faintly, as though alive. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. I reached for the figure, my hand trembling as I closed the distance. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, the carol stopped. A voice rang out, not sung but spoken, clear and commanding. "You have seen the past. Now, you must choose the future." The ground trembled, the carvings on the walls glowing faintly. Above me, I heard the distant toll of the church bell. 11:30. The clock was ticking, and whatever choice lay before me, I had little time to decide. The figure in my hand felt heavier than its size warranted, as though it carried the weight of centuries. The voice that had spoken left an unsettling resonance in the air, a vibration that seemed to pulse within my very bones. I glanced back toward the staircase, desperate to return to the surface, to the safety of the dimly lit church above. But the cavern's carvings seemed alive now, their once static images shifting subtly, showing glimpses of a narrative I didn't fully understand. The toll of 11:30 had passed, and silence engulfed the space once more. I stood there, caught between the oppressive stillness and the faint hum emanating from the figure in my hand. Then, as if drawn by an unseen force, I turned my attention back to the pedestal. Carved into its surface were words, Latin, faintly familiar from my schooling. Tempus est praeteritum, sed futurum est in manibus tuae. The past is gone, but the future lies in your hands. The carvings on the walls shifted again, this time forming a clear image. Villagers gathered in the square, singing together beneath a grand tree adorned with candles. But their joy turned to terror as the flames from the candles spread to the tree, engulfing it. The villagers fell to their knees, their mouths open in silent screams. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the voice returned, more insistent now. "Restore what was lost. Let the light guide you, or darkness will reign eternal." A sudden gust of wind swept through the cavern, extinguishing my lantern. Panic clawed at my throat, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized the faint glow from the figure was still there, pulsing steadily like a heartbeat. I clutched it tightly and began to climb the staircase, each step heavier than the last. The carol resumed, no longer twisted but hauntingly beautiful, a melody that spoke of hope and sorrow intertwined. When I emerged into the church, the candles had extinguished themselves, plunging the nave into shadow. I hurried to the nativity scene, placing the figure back in the empty manger. The moment it touched the wood, the entire display shimmered, the broken pieces reassembling before my eyes. The figures, once twisted and grotesque, now radiated a quiet serenity. The infant's carved face was peaceful, its eyes closed as though in restful slumber. The bells of the church began to toll, 11:55. Time was running out. I rushed outside, the snow falling thicker now, the wind a cacophony of howls and whispers. In the square, the great tree stood silent, its branches bare. The ghostly choir appeared once more, their translucent forms circling the tree. Their song grew louder, and I realized they were waiting for something, for me. Without fully understanding why, I knelt before the tree and began to sing. It was a carol from my childhood, one my grandmother had taught me. The words faltered at first, but as I continued, the melody came back to me, carrying with it memories of warmth and light. The choir joined in, their spectral voices blending with mine in a harmony that was both otherworldly and achingly familiar. The tree began to shimmer, its branches glowing faintly, as if ignited by an inner flame. One by one, candles appeared on its boughs, their light growing stronger until the entire square was bathed in a golden glow. As the final note of the carol faded into the night, the figures of the choir turned toward me. One stepped forward, their form clearer now, almost human. They inclined their head in a gesture of gratitude before dissolving into the air like snowflakes. The bells tolled midnight. The light of the tree dimmed, but it did not go out. Instead, it remained a soft, steady glow, casting long shadows across the snow-covered square. The oppressive weight I had felt since arriving in the village lifted, replaced by a profound stillness. Not the eerie silence of before, but a calm, like the breath of the world finally exhaled. I lingered in the square, watching as the first hints of dawn painted the horizon. The villagers began to emerge from their homes, their faces etched with confusion and wonder. No one spoke of the night's events. The tree stood as a silent witness, its light a reminder of what had passed and what had been restored. As I departed the village that morning, the choir's melody lingered in my mind, a song of redemption and the fragile, flickering light of hope. And so, in that small, snowbound village, the cycle was broken. But as I journeyed into the distance, a single question haunted me: what would happen should the carol ever fall silent again?